My name is Tim Ambler of London Business School, and I'm truly sorry I cannot be with you today. But if you have any questions, or if you'd like to follow up the practical implications of what I'm talking about this morning, then Rory has my phone number. The subject really is about the end of the age of reason and the transfer from reason, which has been the dominant philosophical thinking for the last 200 or 300 years, to the age of sensibility. And that's what I'm really here to talk about, and let's see how we go. I'm a marketing man, so I'm really interested in what consumers do and why they do it, and how our minds work. For example, how do we deal with advertising? So I'm saying that the reasoning process is actually not critical to that, and that raises the question of what is. My thesis is to do with the age of enlightenment, which dawned with Descartes, and I think therefore I am, and that stuff. Thomas Paine called that the age of reason, and reason made science possible, the logic of reason, the way of reasoning, but that was about measuring things. Logic, in a sense, has reached its apotheosis with computers. Computers now have, some have, bigger brains than we will ever have. And reason was then invoked to measure people as distinct from things, with economics and sociology and other ologies and market research. And I think when people are concerned, reason is a sophisticated way of coming to the wrong answer. A very good example of that is when big government, which is supposed to be an efficient way of mass production of services for consumers or constituents, and then they go to big computers, again for economies of scale, and the consequences are almost invariably a big disaster. The income tax, National Health Service, MOD, whenever big government and big computers mix, then there is a disaster. And the disaster is the inevitable consequence of pursuing rationality beyond where it should go. I like Emerson Pugh's version of this, which is that if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, then we would be so simple that we couldn't. And a very similar a quote from a famous mathematician of the 20th century, in any axiomatic mathematical system, there are propositions that cannot be proved or disproved within the axioms of the system. Now that, of course, is implying that neuroscience is fatally doomed, because understanding what is in our minds is beyond the power of our minds. Nevertheless, we can have a go. And coming back to Earth, look at the question of who drives business in Britain. We are fourth for imports, and we're sixth for exports. We import a lot more than we export. The big manufacturing companies are almost all gone, and thank goodness we have small companies still in a good state, because otherwise the country would be even more broke than it already is. And we've converted what we used to export into imports, whether it's clothing, electrical appliances, computers, cars. Kenwood is one example of a very fine British company, which is now no longer a fine British company, and we import it. So why has that happened? And the answer is rational economists, rational accountants, who are doing the mathematics, applying logic, and coming to the wrong answer. And I call these two groups of people economizers, because that's what they do. Economizers, for example, kill the British car industry. We still make cars, but we make cars for other people, because our economizers killed off our domestic industry. And if you move to market research, rationality bias is the biggest single reason why market research is so often wrong. You ask people questions to which they like to respond rationally. I bought brand X because it was good value. That's what they will tell you, but that is not the truth, because they don't know what the truth is. Then you take that research, which has come from rational questioning, and apply quantitative, i.e. rational techniques to those responses, and to make a rational presentation to the clients that is put together in a logical way, and then the client summarizes it rationally for their bosses. And in the academic process, if you try to get any of your work published, it has to be even more rational. But unfortunately, rational means wrong, and that's what I'm here to challenge. Now, if you move to the age of sensibility, as we are now doing, neuroscience tells us what we already really knew, to be honest, which is that our actions and our decisions are driven by what we feel, by empathy with our fellow person, and not a logical evaluation of the alternatives. If you want to know why, the classic way of market research is to ask people what their attitudes to different brands are, and then to use that as a way to predict what brands they're going to buy. And most times that simply doesn't work. And people have always been puzzled because it should work. If we were rational people, then that would work, but we're not, so it doesn't. Economizers have recognized that microeconomics is deeply flawed, to put it politely. So they've came up with things called utilities in the 19th century, which is an umbrella term to mean anything they can't explain. And therefore, if we were doing something for a reason, which they think we always had, then there must be some utility, even if you don't know what the utility is, or how to measure it, or what it looks like. That's been fairly exposed as being fairly unhelpful in the event. So the economists have now come up with behavioral economics, which is the latest buzz jargon, which is basically to stick a sticking plaster over the bit of economics which doesn't come to the right answer and write the right answer on the sticking plaster. I mean, he doesn't actually explain why. It's purely an attempt to post-rationalize economics into coming to the right answer and explaining human behavior. It doesn't actually explain any human behavior. It doesn't actually explain anything at all. All it enables economists to do is to stay in vague touch with reality. Because received economic theory, microeconomic theory, presumes rational consumers maximizing utility, as I said, I don't know what that means, over all the commodity bundles. We look at all the things we could buy, and then we use some rational process to choose what we do buy. Nice idea, doesn't work. And I'm suggesting that as we recognize the limitations of reason and rationality, we will move beyond that to what I call the age of sensibility. For example, we've been doing, in neuroscience, you scan people's brains, mine for example, but anybody else's, in order to try to understand how they deal, in my case, the sort of work I do, how people deal with advertising and how people make brand choices, and insofar as one can, why. So I've just put in a couple of slides, we haven't got time to do much, as examples of the kind of thing that we do. And we're particularly looking for brand equity, and I'll come back to that later. But in this particular case, we were looking at people evaluating different brands of coffee, and for each individual, there was a brand which had high brand equity for that particular consumer, and other brands which had low brand equity. So we subtract the low from the high in order to flag up the brand equity, so to speak. And what we find, of course, is that none of this has got much to do with the rational parts of the brain, and they have quite a lot to do with what we call here self-referential processing. In other words, brands are part of the social fabric. It's who we think we are, who we relate to, that drives our choice of brands. If all our friends drink one sort of coffee, we're more than likely to drink the same sort of coffee. Never mind whether it's better value, cheaper, more expensive, or anything else. It is part of what we do, and brands are a sort of self-expression. Moving on to a second example, this is a slide from a brain scan of somebody undergoing a shopping experience in a supermarket, or a quasi-supermarket. And again, you can see that the parts of the brain involved here are the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex primarily, and the postcingulate. And these are, again, parts of the brain to do with emotion or feelings or affect. The significant part of this slide, because it's not on it, is the rational part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, and that isn't lighting up or is not active at all. And that's because that's not how we make choices. We make choices because they feel right, and not because we've logically worked out that they are best value per gram or whatever. So high brand equity subjects, in other words, subjects looking for a brand which is their favored brand, high brand equity, involves preference. Of course, we've got to make a preference. But interestingly enough, we found that the price of your favored brand matters much less than the price if you're choosing between low brand equity, in other words, brands you don't particularly like, then you look at price. But if it's a brand you like, then the price is the price and you buy it. As George Bernard Shaw wittily observed, that all progress depends on the unreasonable man. People who are reasonable, rational, trying to make everything fit together and trying to cooperate and all these good things, very important parts of society and very important parts of what we all do. But they don't cause us to make progress. And Descartes, a lot of people working in my area have been saying now for 10 years or more, was wrong because, and this all started with a chap called Damasio, who showed that the choice part of the brain was linked with the feelings and the social attitudes and was not particularly linked with rationality. And you can switch off the rational part of the brain and you will still be able to make choices as you do now. You switch off that lower frontal part of the brain and your ability to empathize with people, to have feelings goes, and so does your ability to choose, because these things are deeply connected and linked. We're defined by our social network of relationships, and that defines the brands we choose. So we may like to be seen as reasonable, and we do usually, because that again is part of being part of society. We all like to be seen as reasonable people. So we post-rationalize to explain what we've just done. When you walked into the home where you now live, you probably made up your mind to buy it within a few seconds, because it felt right. It felt right for you and for your family. And then when people said to you later, well, why did you buy that place? Then you come up with a whole list of reasons why it was a sensible purchase. But you didn't use those reasons at the time that you made the choice. And science develops in that same way. If you look at somebody like Einstein in particular, the intuition, the feelings, the sense of what is right, sense of a picture, quite often leads to discovery, new ideas. And then that is confirmed or otherwise and rationalized by scientific method. So the point I'm making is that reason is important. Of course it's important, but it's secondary. It's secondary to sensibility or to feelings. And if we move on to how people make decisions, primarily people make decisions because of memory or habit. I buy the same brand of coffee tomorrow as I bought last week. And indeed, the brain is hardly active as you push the trolley around the supermarket. You're doing this on automatic pilot to a large extent. If the brain has to make an active choice, then, as I said earlier, it will make it on the basis of what feels right, affect. It's not really emotion, but it is the social feelings for things. And that's where the choices are made. Very occasionally, because you're making a choice in a group of people or something like that, where you have to talk about it, then cogitation or thinking or rationality will be brought into play. But that is the hierarchy. So it's usually M. Occasionally it's M plus A, or quite often M plus A, and very rarely it's M plus A plus C. So to look at that in a diagrammatic form, marketers use their techniques, PR, advertising, pricing, promotion, and so on, to try and influence consumers to buy their brand, and the competitors are doing the same thing. And we're unaware of most of that, because if we were aware of it all, we'd go mad. So we filter out a lot of it, but some of it gets through. And then based on what people have in their heads, i.e. brand equity, that determines what they do. And that feeds back into memories of the brands in the brain. Now, what we now know is that advertising is a very weak force, whereas experience is a very strong force. So experience of the brand, the consumption experience, is far more important than advertising or PR or any marketing activities. And we believe now, because there's an interval between advertising and purchase, you see an ad on day 1, you go to the supermarket on day 12, where is the ad effect between days 1 and days 12? And that's what we're trying to find in the neuroscience work that we're doing at the moment. And it's hard to find because it's dark. You know, there is nothing that happens between day 1 and day 12. Nevertheless, what we think is the way it works is that advertising refreshes the memory of the consumption experience. In other words, if I normally buy Nescafe and I see an ad for Nescafe, that isn't going to make me buy Nescafe. All it can do is to make me feel better about my memories of the Nescafe consumption experience. And that's, I mean, obviously different ads work in different ways, and there are all kinds of ifs and buts. But if you're looking for a central way that brand advertising works, that's more or less it. It refreshes our memory of brand experience. So it's this right-hand side of the screen feeding back into the memory, which is what really matters, which is why ultimately it's the product itself that really matters, much more than the marketing or the advertising. And of course, finally, the consumer's behavior comes out for the firm as their profits. So the understanding of advertising as a secondary force to support experience is one of the findings that comes out of this kind of work. So I can now turn to my conclusions. I hope I've not dragged on for too long, but my conclusions are these. Yes, of course, reason is important, and I wouldn't say it isn't. But memory and affect matter more in consumer choices. And not just in the marketing area, but actually all consumer choices, including political parties and their religions and all the other things that we choose about. Dominant rationality, i.e. where rationality is given too much authority, it destroys progress in human understanding. It destroys our ability to do the unreasonable things which cause progress to happen. And it lowers us, basically, to the level of computers. And it's an interesting question whether computers will ever become so powerful that they will run the earth and we will be their slaves. I mean, it's possible. I think it's very unlikely because they are rational and that is their undoing. So I'm saying we're moving from the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, to the age of sensibility. I empathize, therefore I am. Our existence is absolutely, as has been observed repeatedly by philosophers over 2,000 years, our existence is absolutely part of that social fabric, and our brand choices are absolutely part of that social fabric. And one of the ways that we can develop our understanding is with autism, because autism basically is a disease, if you call it that, which limits the same parts of the brain as make brand choices. So as we begin to understand autism better, we'll also understand brand choices rather better. And as we get to be able to fix these problems, we may actually increase the enjoyability, so to speak, of the social fabric in which we all live. I'm suggesting that we need to have economizers because somebody's got to keep account and keep the score, but they should be kept below stairs and they should not be allowed in the boardroom. And finally, neuroscience, it's very new science, only going about 20 years, very exciting, is going to open up our minds to all kinds of things. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said earlier, I'm very sorry I can't be with you now.